Developed by former jukebox repair company and arcade powerhouse Konami, the 8-bit Castlevania games are all impressive achievements for their time and laid out the foundation for one of the most iconic franchises in gaming. At the time of Castlevania's 1986 release, there wasn't much in the way of horror-adjacent games on the NES, so its dark imagery and gothic architecture helped it stand out from the fleet of 2D platformers that ruled the system's library. While it had more graphic visuals and religious iconography than its competitors, none of the designs in Castlevania are particularly original. The creatures that we encounter throughout the series are decidedly cliché, a combination of recognizable figures from the public domain, folklore, and horror cinema alongside common Halloween tropes like skeletons, bats, and ghosts. This dynamic is best expressed by the series' main antagonist, Dracula, whose depiction was inspired by everything from the legendary 1897 Bram Stoker novel to his iconic cinematic appearances. In Castlevania, Dracula is presented as the commander of all evil, an immortal being capable of everything from reviving corpses and possessing people to turning men to stone. He even maintains a healthy professional relationship with death himself. By working with all of this already iconic imagery, Castlevania's vibe was easily understood by consumers, allowing Konami and series director Hitoshi Akamatsu to quickly carve out a niche for it in the industry. The aesthetics are not the most noteworthy thing about Castlevania though. That would be the highly replayable levels and core gameplay. Even the future NES games don't quite manage to capture the concise and tightly designed style of the franchise's debut. Replayability was an important element of game design back in the 80s. Not to say that it has no value today, but now we have access to tens of thousands of games for cheap or even free, with popular games like The Outer Wilds going out of their way to provide meta-commentary on the nature of replayability itself, and ultimately discarding it in favor of a more memorable first playthrough. As a result, most folks are comfortable ending their time with the game after seeing the credits roll for the first time, even if they might have enjoyed a second playthrough. Back in the days of magazines and rentals, things were different though. Games were expensive, and the amount of storage space available on NES carts was puny. The script for this video has a larger file size than Castlevania itself. You had to cherish the games you owned and squeeze every bit of content you could out of them. This isn't an expansive adventure, nor is it trying to be one. Instead, you're expected to master the layout of every inch of Dracula's castle if you want to see it through to the end. The most important element of the game's success in this regard is the lack of a save system. Instead, the developers at Konami have generously provided us with infinite continues, so you won't get kicked back to the title screen for your failures. If you want to slay Dracula and his crew, as Iggy Pop would have said, you're going to need to slaughter all the nail-biting horrors in the castle in one sitting unless you're a coward who uses save states. The only thing keeping you from watching the castle crumble is your own lack of skill and patience. You can quit once you're at your wit's end, but this means that next time you boot up the game, you're going to be restarting from the castle gates. While anything resembling a modern save system was a novelty back then, we don't even have a password system here, which was the standard method for saving your progress at the time. This was a deliberate design decision, and Castlevania makes the most of it. In Raph Koster's book, A Theory of Fun for Game Design, he explains the concept of chunking. Essentially, we take the chaotic and confusing stimuli that we absorb from the world around us and turn it into something that's easy to understand and recall later. In the book, Koster says that we actively seek out ways to engage in this when we're bored because we enjoy this process, the process of learning. Since I hated going to school as much as the rest of you, I'll note that there are all sorts of ways to satisfy this need. Studying a new subject or developing a new skill are some obvious, practical examples, but playing games can satisfy the urge to process and organize new information too. If you've ever played a game for long enough to say you've mastered its mechanics, then you know how much joy there is to be found in memorizing everything from the layout of the world to the inputs needed to perform every action as effectively as possible. Castlevania capitalizes on this by forcing us to replay its dense set of stages over and over. The player will be chunking new information during every playthrough. Using save states completely cripples this part of the experience because every screen of Castlevania is delicately designed to be replayed and memorized, not glossed over once and never again. The secrets are well hidden and rewarding to organically discover, and many bosses have quirks that can be exploited after some experimentation. Once a player has acquainted themselves with Castlevania, they can breeze through it in under 30 minutes or less, and the euphoria of going from a confused rookie to a seasoned vampire hunter is so intense they could have used this game in a Winners Don't Do Drugs campaign. The opening shot introduces us to Dracula's castle and the muscular protagonist, Simon Belmondo. The entire game takes place on the castle grounds, and the visuals are working 8-bit overtime to make it feel like a cohesive space. You can see late game areas in the distance from early levels, and there's a constant sense that you're climbing higher and higher as you progress, except for the middle portion where you fall into the catacombs beneath the castle. The color palettes are pretty funky sometimes, but it's always easy to tell what the graphics represent. Enemies have clear, easy-to-read sprites that sometimes include outlines for improved visibility, and the backgrounds effectively illustrate the different environments of the castle. There are stained glass windows that light the chapel, scientific equipment lining the shelves of the alchemical laboratories, chains hanging off the walls of the obligatory dungeon, and large tattered curtains decorating the halls of the grand entrance. The presentation was fittingly inspired by classic Hammer horror films, an influence that Castlevania wears on its sleeve by featuring a film reel graphic on its title screen. The credits of the game humorously reference famous figures associated with horror media, an amusing but bizarre way to reward players for beating the game. There's a darker reason for this though. Konami didn't allow the people who worked on the game to be properly credited. Allegedly, this was an attempt to retain their staff and prevent them from getting poached by competitors. This was a common practice back in the day, although it still happens now. It's the reason that many early Easter eggs were just a way for some developer to sneak their signature into the game. Next time somebody implies that the gaming industry used to do better, more ethical business, remember that. We've since gotten confirmation from the game's director, seasoned arcade developer Hitoshi Akamatsu, that the intent was to make the player feel like they were the main character of a bombastic horror movie, and I'd say they pulled it off with aplomb given the hardware they were working with. I'll also note that the highly linear level progression serves this design goal in the same way that it serves more contemporary cinematic games like The Last of Us and Metro 2033. Even if it wasn't intentional, this structure lends a sense of constantly rising tension to the proceedings through its brisk and light-stepping pace that would have been much harder to achieve in a more open-ended game. Remember this, because it will be important later. The distinctly dark and gothic tone of the visuals are reinforced by the music. Like many NES soundtracks, the tunes consist of short loops with punchy melodies and simplistic bass lines. Castlevania's musical identity was clearly influenced by Baroque-era classical compositions and utilizes the same functional harmony to evoke its dark fantasy setting. This was a novel combination for its time. The music isn't used in a particularly innovative way, but the functional combination of stage themes that transition into a boss track when the time is right do enough to set the mood. In my mind, the most memorable musical moment comes during the final boss fight, when the music shifts into a more frantic battle theme as Dracula transforms into his demonic second phase. Castlevania has 6 finely tuned blocks consisting of 3 stages each. Your continues only bring you back to the start of your current block no matter how far you progress before dying, with one exception. Your health pool is surprisingly generous. That doesn't mean things are easy though. No, Castlevania wants to brutalize you. Castlevania wants to sucker punch you in the jaw and steal your lunch money. Sometimes literally in the case of Castlevania II. That isn't to say it's unfair though. The early levels do their best to teach you about every type of enemy you'll encounter and show you their behavior before you're forced to contend with them in truly dangerous situations. Players are given a chance to deal with the wave-like patterns of the Medusa heads, the erratic movements of the hunchbacks, and the boomerang axes of the knights in safe environments before they're combined with each other or with other hazards. There's no point where you're introduced to an entirely new enemy out of the blue, and the level designers were clever with how they accomplished this. They start simple and then slowly raise the stakes of each type of scenario that the player encounters until they're sufficiently lethal. The clearest example of this is how the Medusa heads are introduced in Block 2. We first see them in this straight hallway with no other obstacles before being forced to avoid them while navigating stationary platforms. Something clever about this sequence is that the ground of the hallway isn't located at the bottom of the screen like it has been for most of the game up to this point. It's elevated to put Simon closer to the middle of the screen. This gives players a lot of room to observe the Medusa heads without them going off the top or bottom edges of the screen. It only takes 30 seconds to ease players into the climax of the sequence, which asks them to jump across 2 moving platforms while under pressure from the Medusa heads. Many stage layouts are split across 2 elevations, even as early as the first stage, and enemies will be placed on platforms above you so you can observe them before being forced to engage with their attacks. This works because Simon can't attack upwards without sub-weapons, which you won't have access to unless the designers deliberately placed one nearby, and because your foes are typically designed to be approached on level ground, even if that isn't how you first encounter them. Simon's primary weapon, the Vampire Killer Whip, has 3 tiers. He begins holding a leather whip with pitiful damage and range, but you'll quickly upgrade it into a Morning Star that hurts enemies a lot more. The strongest form of the whip has a much longer range than the others and retains the damage and visual design of the Morning Star. The whip reverts to its leather form every time you die, but it doesn't usually take more than a few candles to fully empower it again. It almost makes me wonder what the point of having multiple tiers was to begin with if it was going to be so easy to reach the strongest one. Simon can use his whip to destroy incoming projectiles in addition to enemies themselves, which is an elegant way to make their attacks interactive despite the limited number of input methods on the NES controller. The knights and their throwing axes are a perfect example of how this mechanic is used to make encounters more interesting. They can throw their axes at 2 different elevations, and the best way to deal with them is to destroy them before they reach you. In theory, you can jump over the axes to get closer to the knight, but you're heavily discouraged from doing this because the axes boomerang back to them after they've traveled for a bit. If you can eliminate the axes, you won't have to deal with this, and you'll be able to inflict damage on the knight at the same time, since your whip hits everything it comes into contact with. Therefore, the best way to fight the knights is to respond to the way they throw their axe. When they throw them high, you stand up and whip them, and when they throw low, you crouch instead. Castlevania III would improve on this enemy by giving them a few frames of animation that telegraph what elevation their axes are going to be thrown at. Because these foes only have 2 similar attacks, the strategy for fighting them is easy to parse, but it becomes harder to execute when they're combined with other enemies or obstacles like stairs. Additionally, projectiles can drop power-ups and hearts when they're destroyed, much like the enemies themselves, giving you an incentive to engage with this mechanic even if your foes aren't explicitly designed around the assumption that you'll be targeting their ranged attacks. The first 3 blocks of the game are simple and don't push you too hard on account of the paltry amount of damage the enemies deal. Your main threat will be falling into bottomless pits. Castlevania doesn't require the same intense platforming precision that Super Mario Bros. Or Ninja Gaiden do on account of Simon Belmondo's stiff and static jump arc. As soon as you leave the ground, you're committed to your jump's height and trajectory without any kind of air control. Unlike many of the other landmark NES platformers, you're not even able to control the height of your jump by holding down the button. Simon's whip has a small wind-up that precedes each attack, which make its strikes feel weighty and powerful. To compensate for this delay, the game's response to your attacks is snappy and reliable. The platforming players encounter was all designed with Simon's limitations in mind, so the jumps demanded of you were pretty basic. Castlevania typically increases the difficulty of its platforming sections by combining its simple challenges with enemies instead of creating complex arrangements of platforms that move, sway, crumble, or disappear beneath you. The most precarious spots in these games are ledges where a single hit from an enemy can send Simon careening into a death pit. The mid-game ups the ante by combining Medusa heads, bats, and projectile attacks with platforming. There is a bit of memorization required here. Sometimes enemies will come dashing in from the edge of your screen while you're in the middle of a jump. You'll have to be ready to respond to these threats immediately or be killed. They also start throwing large hordes of enemies at you, forcing you to prioritize targets and dispatch them quickly or risk being overwhelmed. Some of the common foes like hunchbacks and Medusa heads are much more mobile than Mr. Belmondo, and they're often combined with other enemies, leading to some potentially frustrating moments for players who don't respect the threat they pose. Once you hit the late game, which I would define as Block 5, the one where you fight death, they really crank up the difficulty. There are brutal onslaughts of enemies and attacks sweeping across your screen at all times, creating situations that push the player's mobility and attack range beyond their reasonable limits. Sub-weapons become more effective than your whip here, so it's good that Castlevania does an excellent job teaching players to utilize them throughout its runtime. Simon has access to 5 sub-weapons that can drop from candles and monsters. You're shown their value as early as the first major boss, the Phantom Bat. There's a throwing axe placed right before the boss arena, and it is by far the most useful weapon for slaying it. Sub-weapons and power-ups are dropped on death, but you'll still have access to the throwing axe for this fight even if you somehow die. Bosses aren't telegraphed to the player through an obvious hallway like they are in Mega Man, so this was a nice gesture for new players who might not have been mentally prepared to face a tougher foe. Sub-weapons are generally spread out with an impressive amount of consideration. Acquiring one and keeping it through multiple stages might end up giving you something close to free passage through a boss encounter, a concept illustrated by the second boss, Queen Medusa. The pocket watch trivializes her, and the holy water will completely freeze her in place, allowing you to essentially skip her fight with a bit of preparation and a good execution of the obstacles leading up to the arena. Queen Medusa is the last boss affected by the pocket watch, making it the most situational tool in Simon's arsenal. While all these sub-weapon shenanigans sound great, the catch is that you can only carry one at a time. If you pick up another one or die, you'll lose the one that you're currently carrying and there's no take-backsies. Each sub-weapon is distinct and useful enough that all 5 of them would become series staples. The throwing axe's arc is useful against flying enemies, the boomerang deals tons of damage and can easily wipe out groups, the holy water creates a zone of fire that freezes enemies in place while dealing damage, and the pocket watch makes dealing with hordes of fast-moving and unpredictable enemies far easier at the cost of more ammo. Its time-stopping power is more useful on paper than in practice, but it can be valuable. The throwing knife is the only one that you usually want to avoid. It gives you a basic ranged attack that's lacking in both damage and utility. It's sometimes placed in inconvenient spots to trick you into replacing one of your other, more useful tools, or as a low-level option to punish you for dying. To sweeten the deal and give players another incentive to use sub-weapons, breaking candles, blocking projectiles, and killing monsters with a sub-weapon may cause it to drop a double-shot upgrade instead of points or hearts. Continuing to use the same empowered sub-weapon will eventually cause a triple-shot upgrade to drop. Both of these effectively increase the attack speed of your weapon by allowing 2 or 3 instances of them on screen at once, respectively. These power-ups apply to the sub-weapon that you're currently holding and will be lost if you replace it with a different one. This rewards players for holding onto one sub-weapon and using it well by giving them a more powerful version of it. As a result, knowing what sub-weapon is best suited for each challenge, where to find it, how to use it, and how to maintain it are all ways for experienced players to express their skill. The third boss, the Mummy Men, can be easily dispatched using the holy water found near the start of their block. Dying to the mummies themselves will punish you by forcing you to fight them with the throwing knife and your whip, which is definitely suboptimal. The mummies are the first true boss of the game, although there are quite a few ways to trivialize them even without the ideal sub-weapon. You can stand on the lowest tile near the entrance to their room to avoid their attacks and get free hits on them. Breaking that same block to consume the pork chop found inside of it will prevent you from using this strategy, which creates a trade-off between safety and a heal. Players are likely to discover this pork chop quickly since one of the mummies starts right next to the breakable block, concealing it. This is another instance of Castlevania doing a great job placing its power-ups. Healing pork chops are hidden carefully around the castle, and you're given a hint for quite a few of them, but they're still too scarce for you to rely on them to sustain yourself. The game's only real flaw regarding power-up placement are the random drops that can unexpectedly cause you to replace your sub-weapon, something that you can undo. The game also has a nasty habit of dropping useless money bags that give you points instead of ammo, which can be annoying, but maybe they're useful if you're going for a high score. If you want to get real ambitious, you can take a picture of your television and mail it to Nintendo Power to get on their leaderboard. Okay, I'm being a little facetious. Earning points will eventually give you an extra life, and even though those aren't terribly useful, they're still something. The boss fights really start to ramp up in the second half of the game. This fight forces players to evade Igor, a fast-moving enemy that's similar to the Hunchbacks that also throws projectiles constantly. Attacking Igor doesn't drain the boss's HP and only buys you a moment to attack Frankenstein's monster. If you have the boomerang or holy water, this fight becomes substantially easier. You can use the boomerang to hit Igor from a distance or use the holy water to keep him frozen in place with its residual flame effect. However, the hallway leading up to the duo doesn't provide the player with either of these weapons, meaning that dying to the boss can be even more punishing than dying to the Mummy Men. Facing off against Frankenstein's monster and Igor using only your whip is very doable, but it requires a lot of patience and restraint. Igor's movements are effectively random, so the ideal strategy is to attack him once and to get 1 or 2 strikes on the green guy before turning your attention back to Igor. Frankenstein's monster himself is not much of a threat since he doesn't do anything but sway back and forth, but allowing Igor to freely dart around the screen basically guarantees death. Speaking of which, the next big encounter, Death, exacerbates the unpredictable nature of the previous boss by attacking with numerous floating scythes. Like many of the game's most irritating obstacles, they can approach Simon from angles that the whip and sub-weapons can't easily deal with, resulting in some seriously cheap deaths. If you want to take Death down reliably, you might need to carry the holy water from the first hallway of the block to freeze him in place, or rely on the boomerang that you find right before his boss room to keep the scythes at bay. Carrying the holy water might seem like the ideal thing to do, but the hallway right before Death might be the most brutally difficult section of the entire game. There are Medusa heads flying at you from both sides of your screen, and 2 knights throwing axes at you. There's a clear rhythm to everything, but falling out of it for even a moment can have catastrophic results. This set piece is the culmination of everything that the game teaches the player about both the knights and the Medusa heads. Losing the holy water there was almost an inevitability in my own experience, but the reward for scraping through was incredibly satisfying. There's a huge amount of tension after you beat this gauntlet for the first time. You can't quit now, otherwise you're going to have to go through that sadistic death trap again. The final part of the game takes you through the castle's clock tower, and it is not much easier. You'll find yourself swarmed by birds carrying hunchbacks as you navigate the inner workings of the clock. Sometimes you can rush through the stage without too much trouble, but it's more common to get thrown into the gears below. The best option is to hold on to the pocket watch that you can collect from the bridge in the first stage of the block and use it to freeze the enemies in place. That very same bridge is populated by several copies of the Phantom Bat from the first block, and they're excited to send you careening to the ground. Even if you don't have the pocket watch, the segment's short and you won't have to replay it again once you reach the checkpoint before the final boss. I do want to call attention to the background here. For the first time in the game, the sky is clear and most of the details in the background are below you. You're nearing the highest point of the castle where the final showdown takes place. You've climbed your way to the top, and you can imagine the world you've conquered sprawling out below you as you finally get a chance to see the face of the clock tower up close. This is the conclusion to the story that the backgrounds have been telling throughout the entire game. Dracula himself is much more consistent than the previous two bosses, only having one real attack during his first phase. He'll teleport to some random part of the room, potentially on top of you, and then fire a few fireballs in your direction. If you want to avoid taking contact damage from his teleportation, you'll need to keep moving constantly. The angle of the fireball projectiles will vary depending on where Simon's standing when he fires them, but the timing's predictable enough that you can get into a nice rhythm of jumping over Dracula's attacks and attacking his head while you're passing over the flames. This first phase is not limited to the fight itself though. The hallway leading up to Dracula can be grinded for sub-weapon ammo, and his projectiles can be destroyed to collect random double shot or triple shot power-ups. You might not want to do it, but grinding for ammo and power-ups here is almost a necessity. Beating Dracula's second phase will require a good execution of his first phase and an empowered sub-weapon. I found myself using the holy water to destroy Dracula's projectiles in the first phase in order to acquire a triple shot power-up before reaching his transformation. The empowered holy water will make it possible to freeze Dracula's second phase in place until you run out of ammo, similar to Medusa's and Death's fights from earlier, letting you deplete all of his HP without even giving him a chance to attack you. Despite this, I'm sweating hard every time I finally get to his second phase with enough preparation to stand a chance. It's a moment that always puts me into that prized flow state, something that older titles like this are really good at pulling me into. It's an unforgiving challenge that pushes your knowledge of the game's systems to their limits. Thankfully, the designers were generous enough to give the player a checkpoint right before the fight. Seriously, Dracula would be miserable without that checkpoint. After the credits roll, you'll be booted straight into the second quest. This New Game Plus feature makes a few tweaks. Enemies move faster, deal more damage in the early levels, and appear in larger groups. This does increase the difficulty more than you might initially think because of how carefully tuned the standard monster behavior is to the player's movement speed and range. The standard difficulty starts by dealing 2 units of damage to you per hit, and this scales up to 4 units as you progress. The second quest maintains the highest damage value for its entire runtime. Additionally, the game adds enemies where there weren't any before, and this can sometimes result in borderline BS segments. The most memorable instance of this occurs in the second block of the game, where Medusa heads have been added to basically every screen, even this bit where you have to walk under spike traps and time your attempts to pass under them carefully. It seems like the beginning of the catacombs has more aggressive fishman placement too, with a few of them popping up directly below Simon while he's traveling across the moving platforms. The increased damage makes mistakes more punishing, meaning that your knowledge of the first few blocks will be tested much more than it is in the standard difficulty. If there is one criticism I had to make about the second quest, it would be that the modifiers feel less relevant the further you get into the game. Once you reach the point where the enemies were dealing a quarter of your health anyways, it doesn't matter anymore because there aren't any changes to the enemy behavior or the boss fights. The Dracula fight is completely identical as far as I can tell, so if you've learned how to beat it once, you'll have no issue doing it again. There's something magical about watching the castle crumble as the credits roll over the backdrop of a warm sunrise. In fact, it might be one of the most satisfying endings on the NES. And what a fitting conclusion! The solid mechanics, snappy and responsive attacks, and crunchy sound effects make Castlevania an absolute joy to play. It's a real testament to the power of the console and proves that great game design simply doesn't age. The team that made it had a fantastic foundation to work from going forward, and the impressive sales figures resulted in Konami giving them the go-ahead to start working on a sequel. The game they ended up making, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, seems like an odd follow-up at first. Hitoshi Akamatsu returned as the director, and he and his team weren't content to rest on their laurels. No, they were excited to try out some entirely new ideas instead. Simon's Quest maintains the same tight controls and aesthetic sensibilities that define the first Castlevania, but transposes them into a different genre with an entirely different mechanical appeal. This isn't inherently bad, of course. Experimentation is a good thing, and I can think of quite a few NES franchises that went through a similar progression, like Zelda and Super Mario Bros. Kind of. But Simon's Quest remained the most vexing of them all among American audiences for many years. Without the additional context of Vampire Killer, a Japanese and European exclusive sibling of Castlevania released for MSX2 home computers, the move from a traditional 2D side-scroller to something resembling an action RPG seems jarring. Vampire Killer was developed in parallel to Castlevania by a small dev team led by Akihiko Nagata that was tasked with reusing Castlevania's assets to make something that could be released alongside it. This was Konami's way of trying to ensure that there would be a return on their investment in Akamatsu's dream. This alternative take on Castlevania goes through many of the same motions, sharing its premise, stages, songs, and general art direction. The blocks have been arranged in the same order, and many of the most notable set pieces have been convincingly replicated. In this way, it maintains some of the cinematic edge and sense of progression that Castlevania had. Despite all its superficial similarities, Vampire Killer's approach to design is completely different, and every environment's more like a puzzle box or scavenger hunt than a traditional 2D platformer. The halls of Dracula's castle now feature friendly merchants, even more destructible pieces of terrain, and treasure boxes alongside the many dark denizens that we've come to expect from our time in Castlevania. There are tons of hidden items and pieces of gear spread out among all these additions, with some of them being required to progress through the halls of the castle. The merchants accept hearts as currency, so now those are pulling double duty as both cold hard cash and as ammunition, and the treasure boxes can be opened with small keys that are peppered around the game world. Vampire Killer's most dramatic change is probably the simplest one. It doesn't have any continues, and you only have 3 lives. I emphasized how having unlimited continues benefited Castlevania, and that's been thrown out the window here. The end result's a game that feels like it's aged significantly worse than its sibling. That being said, the new mechanics and the focus on digging around the castle for secrets do benefit from this mandated repetition. I found myself learning the levels inside and out so I could chart my own routes through them to acquire all the upgrades I wanted as early as possible within each stage and mastering the game's reworked weapon system. Vampire Killer's technical limitations made it much less enjoyable than Castlevania, but there's still a lot of fun to be had here. The increase in tension from the lack of continues makes each boss encounter and platforming segment feel more dangerous, and it only gets scarier when you remember that dying causes you to lose all the upgrades you've acquired. This can pretty much spell the end of a playthrough once you get to the second half of the game. One failure will snowball into a few more, and then before you know it, you're back to the title screen. The game designers exploit this lack of continues in a really cruel way, even by the standards of retro games. It's full of traps and points of no return that are explicitly designed to trick you into wasting one of your precious lives. If you try playing Vampire Killer by walking to the right as you would in Castlevania, you'll immediately notice 2 key deviations in the formula. The first is the lack of scrolling, and the second is that your progress will be regularly blocked by gates. To open them, you'll need to explore each stage until you find a white skeleton key, making that the game's primary objective. These keys are occasionally positioned in plain sight, but it's far more common for them to be hidden inside of walls. As a result, you'll be spending a lot of time whipping everything you see. Great security system. For whatever reason, perhaps a technical limitation, walls on the edges of the screen are never destructible, so you can safely leave those alone. The process of leaving no stone unturned gets old fast, and there's no attempt at remixing this basic formula throughout VK's runtime. While the placement of these keys and all the other items is rarely intuitive, none of it changes between playthroughs, so you can easily memorize their locations and speed through the castle during replays. The single-screen design has a wide range of detrimental effects on the game, but it isn't really the fault of the style, just this title's execution of it. Single-screen platformers can be successful, and there's numerous notable examples that prove this, like Donkey Kong, Prince of Persia, and more recently Celeste, kind of, and N. For those who don't know what I mean by this, single-screen platformers are games that have hard transitions between individual screens instead of scrolling between them. Most games, including Castlevania itself, utilize a mix of hard transitions and scrolling because the transition between screens gives the developers an opportunity to load new assets into memory or swap the color palettes of sprites out of the player's view. While the MSX2 was capable of side-scrolling games, they deliberately chose not to take advantage of that feature here so that the levels could loop on themselves. Dracula's castle's been turned into some kind of non-Euclidean nightmare, and your only means of escape is finding that skeleton key. I definitely prefer the side-scrolling action of Castlevania, but this is an interesting approach, and they do take advantage of the repeating screens to create some unique puzzles that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. One notable example occurs in Block 3, where you're required to drop through the entire stage to reach a high point on the screen with the exit gate. I quite like this moment despite how illogical it is, but it also taught me that I wouldn't always die if I fell off the bottom of the screen on this stage. That isn't the case. There are still bottomless death pits all over the place in Vampire Killer, even in the same section of this very block, and there's no easy way to differentiate between a drop that will loop around to the top of the map and one that will end one of your 3 lives. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. This lack of scrolling makes a few of Castlevania's most common enemies, Medusa heads and bats, much harder to deal with because they always appear at the edge of the screen. When the view scrolls with you like it does in the NES game, you're given a good amount of time to react to their presence because you're usually in the center of the screen in the areas where they can appear. A prime example of this is the corridor with moving platforms in Block 2 that I mentioned earlier. The challenge here is the same in both games, but Vampire Killer is significantly harder because of the stiffer controls and the fact that Medusa heads can appear at the edge of the screen and score a hit on you at seemingly any time. It feels like the game tries to suppress monster spawns when you're right next to the edge of your screen, but cheap shots still happen. Hearts that drift off the edge of your screen vanish forever too, causing you to lose out on items if a candle was placed too close to the border. Another concern is that pesky knockback, which was carelessly carried over. I didn't mind this too much in Castlevania, but it becomes a much bigger issue here because you can be knocked into different screens when you take damage, causing all the enemies on that screen, specifically the enemies and nothing else, to respawn. This is really problematic because of how scarce healing items and other helpful buffs are. If it was me programming the game, I would have treated the borders of the screen like walls while the player's in the knockback state so they wouldn't get thrown between screens. On a more positive note, Vampire Killer has expanded on a few areas, most notably the one right before Frankenstein's monster in Igor. It's a single hallway with 2 bone dragons in Castlevania, but here they've split it into 4 hallways connected by what appear to be sewage pipes. This transformed the section into something resembling a maze that really takes advantage of the single-screen style, and the developers were courteous enough to place the skeleton key at the very end of the sequence beside the door to the boss. The only threats to be found here are bone dragons, which are trivial if you purchase the reflective shield from a merchant found in a prominent location earlier in the same block. There's another merchant within the maze that sells the Battlecross weapon, which we'll discuss in more depth later, that trivializes the upcoming boss fight by allowing you to deal damage to Frankenstein's monster from a safe distance. Both of these are examples of good item placement, and these tunnels are one of the few times where the designers expand on a concept that the original Castlevania left unexplored. Tragically, they messed up this beautiful segment with the placement of its key. It seems like the skeleton key always appears in the top left quadrant of the blocks they're hidden in, which means that this one ends up appearing a little bit too high for Simon's jump to reach. You'll need to jump off a platform in the same room to get it, but if you ignorantly or accidentally smash it during your confrontation with the bone dragon guarding the door, you've effectively soft-locked your game. Since the destructible terrain doesn't respawn when you leave the screen and come back, you'll have to lose one of your 3 lives to reset the stage and bring the missing stone back, or damage boost your way to the key by intentionally taking damage from the bone dragon. Neither of these solutions are intuitive, but I wouldn't have encountered this problem in the first place if it wasn't for this outright poor level design. This situation is a microcosm of the entire experience, really, although this specific issue could be easily fixed by moving the key into the stone that I broke to get stuck here in the first place, or by making it indestructible like most of the other ones in the game. The shift towards a focus on exploring these mini levels has resulted in quite a few differences in the other game mechanics. Instead of acquiring sub-weapons like the ones in Castlevania, you're looking for equipment to provide you with passive buffs. You can purchase these items from merchants scattered around the castle and hidden inside of walls. I'm starting to see a trend here. Alternatively, you can hunt around for those small keys I mentioned earlier and use them to open those tiny blue chests, which sometimes contain useful pieces of gear. These chests and the keys that open them are often hidden inside of walls. Really, guys? Really? We're doing this? Okay. You can only carry one small key at a time, which sometimes results in backtracking if you want to open everything, although I'd argue it usually isn't worth the time. One of the possible upgrades is a shield that would later appear in Simon's quest in the form of Dracula's rib. Well, there are actually two shields that you can find in Vampire Killer. The first one halves the damage you receive, and the other, which functions the same as Dracula's rib, blocks projectiles like fireballs and bones. Both versions of the shield are incredibly useful, although I tend to find the damage reduction one a lot more beneficial because it helps against every type of enemy and not just the ones that can fire projectiles. In addition to these, you can find boots that increase your movement speed, wings that increase your jump height, and a set of black and white Bibles that either greatly increase or greatly decrease the prices offered by merchants. The Black Bible, obviously the evil one, doubles the prices, which is a massive handicap, and picking up more than one of them causes the effect to stack, further increasing the prices. These are scattered all over the place to punish players for picking up everything they see without taking a closer look at it first, and that worked on me. It didn't take long for me to start observing the items that pop out of chests and candles before grabbing them, just in case it was a spooky Bible. VK's weapon system is unique among the classic Castlevania games, not just because it lacks the iconic sub-weapon system, but because some of them replace your whip entirely instead. The Morning Star still acts as the straight upgrade to the basic leather whip, but the throwing knife, so-called boomerang axe, and battle cross are now primary weapons. The throwing knife is probably the best overall thanks to its speed and range, but the axe and cross both work in a really cool, albeit impractical way. These are throwable weapons that fly back to you after they reach the end of their range, and you have to catch them on their return trip if you don't want to lose them entirely. This is a lot harder than it sounds if you threw the weapon in the air, but I still love this mechanic and the way it feels to use. Your punishment for dropping the axe or the cross is going back to your trusty whip, but the potential reward for using them is high because each of these projectiles deal multiple instances of damage as they collide with enemies. It's a cool idea, and I'd like to have seen it develop further in future Castlevania games, although sadly that didn't happen. The closest thing that the mainline series has to this is the boomerang, which can be caught while it's returning to you, although doing so only lets you throw another one slightly faster. It would have been cool if catching the boomerang refunded the ammo you spent to throw it. This could be balanced out by increasing its cost to 5 hearts, making it a riskier weapon with the potential for skilled players to use it as a renewable damage source. The most important upgrades besides the alternative weapons are the ones that function kinda like the sub-weapons from Castlevania, the Holy Water and the Hourglass, which is this game's equivalent of the Pocket Watch. You can carry both of these simultaneously and use them at any time as long as you have the ammo to do so. Both items cost 5 hearts, which is an increase in price for the Holy Water that's balanced out by its elevated power level. You can only throw the Holy Water while you're airborne now, which takes a little bit of getting used to, but none of the monsters in Vampire Killer have invulnerability frames, so they all melt away on contact with its flames. The game's boss fights are a lot less interesting because the designers didn't make enough adjustments to them to compensate for the changes to the player's capabilities. They're mostly the same as the ones in Castlevania, and the ones that have had their arenas or attacks tweaked only received subtle changes. I sincerely missed the throwing axe during the Phantom Bat fight because of how much harder it is to hit flying enemies with the whip, and the same is true for the boomerang during Death's fight. The developers have tried to incentivize planning a unique loadout for each fight by wiping your inventory at the start of every block, but this doesn't actually make the boss fights themselves more interesting, only the lead up to them. Vampire Killer's detrimental focus on exploration and routing is on full display here. While there is still some strategy in picking up a weapon and sticking to it through an entire level while you acquire upgrades, it doesn't even compare to the deliberate placement of sub-weapons and their interactions with the bosses of Castlevania. Without the depth added by those systems, these would-be climactic fights often boil down to spamming the attack button and hoping that you came through the gate prepared enough to slay the boss before it slays you. The sad part is that this usually works even if you came into the arena with missing health. Learning how to take advantage of the more upgrade-oriented structure is vital because the whip is less effective here, despite the game being named after it. Enemies that could be failed in a single strike in Castlevania, like the bone-throwing skeletons, will now take quite a few hits to bring down, and the second Morning Star upgrade that extends the range of Simon's attacks has been removed. This lower range and increased time to kill make taking damage from your targets a lot more likely. It seems like the developers tried to compensate for this by making Simon more durable too, and by simplifying enemy attack patterns. Each bit of damage only takes off a sliver of his health bar even without the shield, but this chip damage adds up quickly in a world with limited healing. Making everything tankier has the unfortunate side effect of slowing down the pace of the entire game, especially when combined with the focus on exploration and the presence of respawning monsters. The axe-throwing knights are the most obvious example of an enemy whose complexity has been reduced. I went out of my way to praise these guys earlier because they ask players to respond to the elevation of their attacks on the fly, but they only throw their axes at a single elevation in Vampire Killer. Seeing such a great foe get neutered like this makes me sad, but maybe it's for the best, since dealing with fully powered knights in the hallway before death without any continues sounds like a punishment fit for those trapped in the 5th circle of hell. Oh, wait, they've removed that bit entirely. Thanks? In addition to its lower damage output, Vampire Killer's iteration of the whip lacks a persistent hitbox that sticks around for Simon's entire attack animation. This makes it a lot harder to strike smaller, fast-moving enemies, with frequent foes like the Hunchbacks, Medusa Heads, and Birds becoming an even bigger annoyance than they would have been otherwise. I'd say they're more threatening than the Knights. Even worse, if a small enemy gets right on top of Simon, the whip won't hit them unless you can create some space between their hitbox and Simon's body. It's obvious that the whip only deals damage in a very small area in front of Simon for a handful of frames, and that's most noticeable when you're trying to take out candles. While focusing on the interactions between your attacks and candles might seem like a trivial detail, especially since the issue extends to combat with enemies, it illuminates the importance of one of the franchise's core mechanics that usually goes unnoticed. Candles are Castlevania's answer to the coins from Super Mario Bros., although the mystery blocks are also an apt comparison, and the level designers use them to direct players through the world in a similar way. These containers could have been pretty much anything, but candles, braziers, and sconces were probably selected because they were an organic fit for the environments of the castle. Each candle is a breadcrumb that can be used to guide the player towards their destination or give them hints about secrets. While the coins in Mario will eventually reward skilled players who don't die with extra lives, individual candles are the main source of hearts, sub-weapons, and power-ups throughout most of the Castlevania games. Players will spend an absurd amount of time batting at them in search of resources because of this. At first, this seems like an odd choice. Why not just put the items out in the open? Why not put everything in treasure chests or inside of blocks? Why are players required to destroy candles of all things to get access to a collectible? Because it creates tension. Players are taught to anticipate items from every candle as early as the first screen, but they have no way of knowing exactly what they'll contain, only that it's something that they'll probably want. This anticipation builds as they approach it, take out any enemies between them and their momentary goal, and start winding up their whip to resolve that tension and get their reward. To live up to this hype, the act of destroying candles needed to be as satisfying as it could possibly be. There are two forms of feedback when a candle is destroyed: a heavy thud and the satisfaction of a prize falling to the ground. Just like a piñata. Castlevania does an excellent job making the crack of Simon's whip feel good thanks to its crunchy sound design and the way that each container interacts with your weapon's hitbox. The timing of your attack doesn't need to be precise, the whip just needs to touch a candle while it's deployed. They're often positioned at Simon's eye level or at the peak of his jump arc, which means that they're easy to hit while you're cruising through a level on autopilot. When they are placed somewhere between these two heights, you can try to strike them directly by timing your input carefully, but if you're a little early on the draw, your whip will still destroy it as you fall to the ground. Not only does this feel better than missing the candle once or twice like I often do in Vampire Killer, it ensures that the player can maintain a sense of forward momentum. I also want to take a moment to diss Vampire Killer for adding trapped candles that contain slime monsters. These are straight up cheap, and the only way to deal with them is to learn what containers are full of slime and which ones aren't through trial and error. Once again, the designers of Vampire Killer are trying to punish players for recklessly collecting items, but I wish they would have implemented mimic chests instead. These traps, along with the Black Bible, subvert the player's anticipation by denying them the reward they were expecting. One curious detail about the hearts in particular is the way they slowly drift to the floor while swaying back and forth. This is an element of visual intrigue that contrasts the way the other items just drop. It's memorable and bizarre, which is probably why they became a staple of the series. Vampire Killer sort of messes this up. The sprite for the heart that's shown as it falls is different from the sprite we see once it reaches the ground. After struggling to get through the castle with only 3 lives, I was able to trivialize the confrontation with Dracula himself by hoarding gear I found throughout the last stage. The most important items that I brought with me were the throwing knife and the damage reduction shield. The low damage of the knife made the fight go on for quite a while, but I never felt like I was in any real danger because of my long range, even though I did take quite a few hits. His first phase is similar to the one that we discussed before, although the lack of sub-weapons and sub-weapon upgrades means that you can focus solely on avoiding his fireballs. This would have given the developers some bandwidth to make his attack pattern more complex, but they did the opposite. His fireballs always fire in the exact same cone pattern no matter where Simon is on the screen. You can easily avoid his attacks by standing at a distance and ducking under the middle projectile, although this is admittedly much easier to do with a ranged weapon than it is with the whip. After you deal enough damage to his face, Dracula transitions into his second phase. Instead of morphing into a winged demon, he takes control of the giant portrait of himself that he hung in the background of the arena and spews bats out of its mouth. This volley of nocturnal wildlife seems to be his only attack, and it's ridiculously hard to dodge. To deal damage to him, you'll need to strike the gem embedded in the forehead of the painting. This is an absolutely insane task if you don't have a ranged weapon, since you'll need to climb the stone platforms on either side of the screen and then leap off of their highest point to get a shot at it. I was able to beat both faces of Dracula's fight on my first try thanks to all the preparation I did prior to the showdown. After how hard the rest of Vampire Killer had been, I was expecting more from the final boss, but I suppose I should be grateful that I didn't have to replay the entire game multiple times to take him down. There's not a cinematic shot of the castle crumbling this time around, just a simplistic text crawl that's on par with a lot of the other endings from this era that leads into the game's credits. Wait, this game gets real credits? Are you kidding me? Anyways, this didn't surprise me since Vampire Killer doesn't recreate the level transition sequences from its source material either, instead opting for hard cuts between each of them. This isn't that big of a deal in isolation, but when combined with everything else, it just makes the whole affair feel kind of empty. It lacks that level of flair and polish that made Castlevania such a generation-defining experience. Once the credits are over, you're thrown into a second quest that presumably functions as a hard mode like the one in the NES title, but please forgive me when I say that I don't care to find out this time. The thought of trying to beat this game twice with 3 lives is enough to scare away even a masochist like me. Vampire Killer was an interesting experiment, but if this was the only Castlevania there was, you'd probably have been spared from watching this video, because I don't think there'd be much of a series to discuss. It's clear that Akamatsu's vision was still vital to the series at this point. If anyone was going to drive it forward, it was going to be the original creator and his team. While it's not as tightly designed or refined as the Castlevania we all know, Vampire Killer's influence on the series would be profound. This is where Simon's Quest comes in. It's a sequel that clearly seeks to combine the gameplay styles of the 2 original Castlevania siblings into one experience. It carries over the basic controls and enemy design of Castlevania and the exploration-driven progression from Vampire Killer while expanding the scope of both. This was an admirable and ambitious direction to take the series, but the game itself leaves a lot to be desired. The disappointment begins as soon as we start a new game. Instead of seeing a cutscene like the iconic opening shot of Castlevania, we're dropped straight into the first town without any real direction. The minimal plot summary of the title screen informs us that Simon has returned to Transylvania to cure himself of a curse that was inflicted upon him during his climactic fight with Dracula. His body is withering away, and he has to find a way to revive his nemesis and slay him for a second time to rid both himself and Transylvania of Dracula's curse once and for all. Or at least until the next sequel. We aren't exactly sure how to do that when we begin though, at least without the game's manual. Simon has to collect Dracula's organs, which have been scattered around the world in a series of mansions, and then return to the ruins of Castlevania to perform a ritual to revive him. Seems easy enough. The player's first instinct will probably be to interact with some of the villagers in town. This is where we see the biggest and most tragic flaw of the game, the downright atrocious English translation. The stuff of nightmares really, more so than any of the monsters in the game. Bad translation is a bugbear for tons of NES games, but it's an especially egregious issue here because the NPCs are supposed to be your main source of information. The first villager we encounter tells us that the first thing to do in this town is buy a white crystal, which is very actionable advice. None of the villagers were given names, and they reused a narrow set of sprites, so you have to chat with everybody you see to find somebody who's willing to sell you this crystal. This first task is actually quite important and will lead the player into the longest running quest line that the game has to offer, which involves trading this white crystal for different colored ones to progress through a few key riddles in the game. So far so good. The next unnamed villager says a crooked trader is offering bum deals in this town, presumably the fellow that we'll be purchasing the white crystal from. Or so you'd think. While that might end up being the conclusion that a new player comes to, this wise old man's actually supposed to explain that there are folks living in hidden rooms in the buildings in town. This information is really important and relevant to every town in the game, but players are left to discover it on their own because of the bunk localization. While those coming from the first game will expect secrets in the form of destructible walls and such, they were never required for progression in Castlevania. This is clearly an element taken from Vampire Killer. Personally, I spent my first few hours wondering why there were so many empty houses in Transylvania. I guess all the monsters have scared away those who could afford to leave. Finally, some affordable housing. There's another NPC who tells us that a magic potion will destroy the Wall of Evil. This magic potion he's referring to is the Holy Water, which can be used to destroy those fake blocks. Who's supposed to figure that out? I've never heard anybody call Holy Water a magic potion before in my life. These mistakes don't mean too much in isolation, but the problems created by these bits of mistranslated advice are a microcosm of the confusing and cryptic nature of the entire game. In the original Japanese text, villagers would often be ill-informed or outright lie to Simon. This is perfectly acceptable on its own. In fact, an argument could be made that it creates a more immersive setting, as it does in the Elder Scrolls series, but it's catastrophic when combined with the poor localization. It's so bad that the text displayed on the ending screens was outright swapped on accident, resulting in a sloppy-feeling product and some seriously baffling conclusions. The funky translation errors can sometimes be entertaining as unintentional comedy, but villagers are rarely as useful to the player as that first bit of dialogue directing them towards the White Crystal. While you're navigating the town and looking for merchants, you'll no doubt take some time to absorb the excellent music and visuals. If there's one thing that Simon's Quest excels at, it's definitely the presentation. The town theme, titled The Silence of Daylight, is your first indication that Simon's Quest will be scored by the same catchy gothic loops that the original Castlevania was full of. The music has a more upbeat tone this time, despite the actual gameplay being less energetic, but it still has the same overall compositional style of the original Castlevania. Once again, the arrangements really show off what the NES's limited sound technology was capable of through some of the most well-known music in the entire series. In many respects, the song Bloody Tears is the most iconic Castlevania track out there, even surpassing Vampire Killer from the first game. The fact that this soundtrack is on par with the originals is evidence of the skill of Konami's sound team at the time and the impeccable musical identity of the series. The graphics are more polished here too, and typically avoid the vague clumps of pixels and strange color palettes from the previous game. Simon's Quest takes us through a variety of environments around the monster-infested countryside of Transylvania, which is defined by dense forest, dank caverns, scenic mountain ranges, and eerie cemeteries. Sadly, these locales are merely the liminal spaces in between your true destinations. You'll be spending a majority of your time interacting with villagers and searching for Dracula's body parts inside the dungeon-like mansions. Unfortunately, they all have identical tile sets. The only visual differences between them are their color palettes. Maybe this was a technical limitation or something, but given how impressive and varied the locales in Castlevania III ended up being, I'm not convinced. The mansions are also dull for mechanical reasons we'll explore later, which means that a bulk of your game time will be spent exploring the least interesting parts of Transylvania. While looking around the first town, you'll come across 3 separate merchants selling important items. One is selling the aforementioned White Crystal for 50 hearts, another is selling Holy Water for 50 hearts, and the third one's selling a Thorn Whip for 100 hearts. You only have 50 hearts to start with, and the Holy Water and Crystal are both essential, meaning you'll have to scrounge up some funds to start your adventure in earnest.
Wow! Pocket lint!
It's fine to ignore the Thorn Whip, since you don't need it to acquire any of the future whip upgrades, and none of your enemies are enough of a threat to justify the time investment it takes to afford it, although newbies might end up foolishly wasting their hearts on it anyways. Regardless, players will either miss out on one of the important items or realize that the best solution is to grind for hearts. Grinding is a common trope across many genres, including the Elder Scrolls games that I praised earlier, but starting the player off in a situation that forces them into grinding is not a good first impression. You will definitely need to go hunting for monsters in the countryside to purchase this stuff, and you'll need to walk out of town to do that. Unaware players might head to the right side of the screen as if they were playing a traditional 2D platformer, and the game designers were clever enough to assume that we'll do exactly that. The right path out of town takes us straight into a wooded area with a few classic wolfmen and undead skeletons to fight. As you wander deeper into the woods, you might start to notice how simple the level design is. It's just the first section of the game, of course, but it's a huge step down from the first screens in Castlevania. You're mostly walking across flat ground with an occasional ledge to hop up or a pit of water to jump over. The original Castlevania used verticality within its stages to teach players about enemy behavior, craft threatening enemy encounters, and to make Dracula's castle feel tall and imposing. This dynamic level design has been lost in the sequel. I mentioned how I felt like I was climbing Dracula's castle as I progressed, but Simon's Quest, despite its focus on exploration, doesn't even come close to recreating that sense of scale. There are so many named locations now, which should give the impression that you're traveling across a larger segment of Simon's world, but the borders between things are unclear and it's hard to create a labeled map of the game in your head as you play. This is another opportunity for chunking that games are uniquely positioned to provide us as the only artistic medium capable of testing our spatial reasoning and navigational skills directly. The world is structured as a straight line that extends to your left and to your right, with Simon starting somewhere near the middle. Your ultimate goal, Castlevania itself, is on the far right side of the map, although you won't be able to reach it or the nearby locations immediately thanks to an impassable obstacle. The countryside's minimal level design exacerbates the vague nature of the environment. There's a distinct lack of landmarks because much of the game consists of flat, lifeless spaces. Screens in between towns and mansions bleed together, so do the towns themselves because of the aesthetic flaws I outlined earlier. The game doesn't provide a map, so you're probably going to need to draw one yourself. I think this would be a good thing in a game that provided significant points of interest, but we have nothing of the sort here. I got the impression that Transylvania is a super flat region of the world, which is obviously contradicted by the mountain ranges in the background. A simple text overlay that tells you the name of the area you're in would have gone a long way, but an even better solution would have been to spread unique encounters and mechanically distinct locales across the world. The few interesting ideas that do appear, such as the poison swamps, are often reused somewhere else. Even worse, there's so much empty space that enemy encounters quickly become boring. The countryside and the enemies throughout seem like they were designed to be as simple as possible because players will end up wandering back and forth between areas multiple times. You can only fight a skeleton slowly walking towards you in a field so many times before you start dozing off. Simon's Quest is also much easier than either of its predecessors because of its uncomplicated and barren level design, which some might view as a positive, but it's totally missing any sense of tension, pacing, or friction, and therefore lacks the cinematic edge that the original Castlevania was known for as a result. This is an open-world game in some respects, so this was inevitable, but they could have softened the blow by preserving the strong design sensibilities of the original title within the mansions. Unfortunately, those don't fare much better than the overworld. While they have pitfall traps, vertical platforming, and hidden pathways to discover that make them more interesting, the enemy design is still too basic to result in anything as tense or challenging as the hallway leading up to death from the first game, or even the moving platforms in the catacombs beneath the castle. There's just enough complexity to push the player into using sub-weapons like the holy water to deal with enemies, or interact with the environment in search of hints and walls of evil. The mansions are hamstrung by the same two-way design restrictions as the overworld because you have to walk all the way back out of the mansion after reaching the end. This feels like blatant padding. These areas could have been designed as traditional Castlevania stages that teleported you back to the entrance after a boss fight, but instead they feel like botched Zelda dungeons, and even those have the courtesy to warp you back to the entrance at the end of your one-night stand. None of the environments contain candles to smash either, which was an important and satisfying part of both of the preceding games that would have still made sense here. Instead, monsters are the only source of hearts. While you're processing the simplified layouts, your epic battle with a wolfman will be interrupted by the infamous "what a horrible night to have a curse" text crawl. This is nice if you're trying to grind out hearts to purchase items, because monsters drop twice as many hearts at night. Monsters get additional health under the moon too, which makes it slightly more dangerous to travel. Despite this, traveling under the Veil of Moonlight's the most time-efficient thing Simon can do. Everything inside of the towns is closed off after the sun goes down, and NPCs are replaced with zombies, so you're encouraged to spend your days interacting with villagers, and your nights traveling and treasure hunting. After collecting some hearts, you'll notice that Simon can level up now. This is an obscure mechanic that isn't explained to the player, but all it does is slightly increase Simon's damage resistance and maximum HP, so you aren't missing out much if you don't utilize it. Simon's level is capped by what area of the game world he's currently in, and you're given a chance to level up in between each mansion. There are some exceptions to this, but they aren't explained to the player in any way. This is an effective but cryptic way to ensure that players are never stronger than they're supposed to be for a given section. I'll praise this since it's solid game design on paper, but the game's bosses and levels never capitalize on the potential of gating the player's power in this way, and the huge amount of damage Simon can take as a result of the system make face tanking a viable strategy, just like it was in Vampire Killer. Hearts are immensely important in Simon's Quest, just like they were in Vampire Killer because they're used for leveling up, buying items, and as ammo for sub-weapons. The game exploits this by punishing you for game overs by erasing all of your hearts. Getting a game over doesn't do anything else. Simon respawns right next to where he died, which means that death only has consequences if you're carrying a bunch of hearts to purchase an item or something. This nullifies all the tension that might have remained in the game's streamlined level design by allowing you to brute force every challenge. It also means that game overs, and by extension death itself, only exist to waste your time by forcing you to grind. In isolation, this is an annoying, less engaging, but honest representation of how death functions in any game, but Simon's Quest has a sinister motivation behind this time-wasting implementation of its lives mechanic. From the moment you start the game, there's a timer ticking down. Simon's dying from his curse, and if you don't complete the game quickly enough, he'll perish after his rematch with Dracula, rewarding the player's efforts with the bad ending. While you might have thought that you were making a wise financial decision by saving up for upgraded supplies during your first day in Transylvania, you may have actually condemned Simon to a painful death instead of a peaceful retirement. All the time-wasting fluff is an intentional distraction or punishment meant to subtly push the player towards the bad ending. Getting one of the good endings requires intimate knowledge of the game's layout, item placements, mechanics, and some favorable luck with random drops. You can throw your hopes of getting the best ending on your first playthrough into the nearest pool of water because it's difficult to do legitimately without a guide or some trial and error. Now, in fairness, this does give the game some replayability on paper. I praised the first game for its highly replayable levels, but I won't extend that praise here because of how the designers have gone about crowbarring replayability into their game. Instead of crafting a series of tightly knit levels interwoven with secrets and unique encounters, they're really only testing your memory and, debatably, your time management skills. I actually think that this whole timer thing could have been a really cool foundation for this quest. In reality, it can be safely ignored by grinding for hearts inside of the mansions, since time doesn't pass while you're exploring any interior spaces. Yeah, that's right. This can be exploited to make the passage of time completely irrelevant, giving players a way to circumvent not only Simon's curse, the premise of the game's narrative, but to trivialize one of the game's most interesting challenges too. Maybe this was a technical limitation, maybe it was an oversight. It breaks the game either way. While grinding for hearts is sometimes necessary to acquire items, the most valuable pieces of equipment are found within the mansions in the form of Dracula's organs. Simon has access to a lot more tools than he did in the first Castlevania, but he's been gimped in other ways to compensate for this. For instance, to make the shield, also known as Dracula's rib, more valuable, they removed the ability for Simon's whip to destroy enemy projectiles. Gone are the days of timing your own attacks to match an enemy's attack pattern, instead you must stop attacking to block incoming damage. It's a less satisfying system than the simpler one from Castlevania because of how passive it feels. Blocking a projectile with an attack requires an action from me, whereas using the shield requires me to cease my inputs to be effective. In Vampire Killer this wasn't the case. The shield would deflect projectiles as long as it was in your possession, even while you were attacking. After you're done grinding for your first sub-weapon, the Holy Water, you'll notice that it functions a bit differently here than it did in the original. It used to be one of the most powerful offensive tools, but that's no longer the case. The delicate balance of the sub-weapon system has once again been discarded in favor of turning them into lasting rewards for exploration. Both of the returning sub-weapons, the throwing knife and the Holy Water, don't cost anything to use. You're free to spam them as much as you want, although enemies quickly scale beyond their low damage values as you enter more dangerous areas. There's a few newer and more powerful tools that do cost hearts to use though, like the Diamond and the Sacred Flame, and you can find 2 optional ammo-consuming upgrades for the throwing knife that make it feel more useful than it did in the first game. The first of these upgrades, the Silver Knife, penetrates enemies. The second deals multiple instances of damage per hit. Think of it like a bleed effect. The abundance of flat areas help their contributions to your offensive arsenal feel more significant too, but even the empowered throwing knives are still less useful than the Diamond, which bounces all over the screen as it obliterates enemies. No aiming required. Why would you worry about positioning yourself on the same elevation of your opponent or timing your attacks in midair when you could just lob a few of these guys out and let the game do the work for you? Simon can now carry every sub-weapon at the same time and switch between them through an inventory screen. This means you won't end up accidentally replacing your pocket watch with a throwing knife or having your possessions wipe between blocks this time. Instead, players build up a toolkit as they progress through the game, and they're given the freedom to develop a unique strategy for each encounter. This was a great idea and opens up tons of new possibilities in the level design. Enemies with different weaknesses could have been mixed and matched to design situations that force players to consider their approach carefully or prioritize targets based on the weapons they've found. Maybe the mansions could have been designed to take advantage of each sub-weapon's capabilities through the use of puzzles like in The Legend of Zelda. I could even imagine a version of Simon's Quest where each encounter has multiple solutions contingent on the player's sub-weapon of choice. To illustrate this point, let's return to the hallway leading up to death from the first game. Instead of being stuck with the boomerang, we could have had access to the pocket watch and the holy water too. The pocket watch costs 5 hearts to use instead of 1 like everything else, but it would make this hallway much easier by freezing the enemies in place. The trade-off for this would be that you'd have less ammunition to use on the holy water or the boomerang while fighting death, who's immune to the pocket watch anyways. Simon's Quest fails to capitalize on this potential even though the designers were clearly aware of it. The holy water is acquired in the first town and used throughout the entire game to destroy walls and floors of evil. While it is useful, there's no decision making here. I'm just baptizing every inch of Transylvania looking for fake blocks. It gets old fast, just like taking swings at the walls in Vampire Killer does. To make things worse, the game isn't challenging enough to justify putting any thought into your approach. Pretty much everything will work all the time, something you'll discover when you start exploring and enter your first mansion. New players will likely come across the one containing Dracula's rib first, and its entrance as an invisible platform that's revealed to Simon when he's in possession of the white crystal. This would be a teachable moment if there was some indication that the white crystal is the reason you can see the platform, but there isn't one as far as I can tell, and you can stand on it without the crystal. I've already been over a few of the weaknesses of the mansions, but I have even more to say about them. They operate on a simple formula similar to the one in Vampire Killer. Find a merchant that'll sell you an oak stake, basically the skeleton key, and find an orb to strike with that oak stake. Dracula's body parts are found inside these orbs, and they're always found in the deepest room of the mansion. Finding the merchant is the main challenge here because the first few mansions don't have boss fights, and you're put right back in the same spot if you do somehow get a game over. Searching for these guys doesn't serve a purpose in the broader time-based metagame of Simon's Quest either, since, as we've already mentioned, the clock doesn't move while you're inside of them. What's worse is that the boss fights that are in the game are horrible, which only compounds my disappointment. I spent a lot of time praising the boss fights of Castlevania, but there's almost nothing to say about the ones in Simon's Quest. There's only 3 of them this time: Death, a crying mask called Vampira, and Dracula himself. Death and Vampira can be outright ignored by walking through their boss chambers. That's right, there's nothing forcing you to confront them. If you do decide to fight them for the items they drop, you'll quickly discover that they're even more simplistic than the Phantom Bat from Castlevania's first block. Death slowly floats towards the player while periodically spawning a single scythe projectile, which is downright pathetic compared to his other fight. He must have taken the loss personally and fell into a deep depression. The poor guy can't even muster up the courage to fight Simon this time. Vampira floats around the room while spewing out a constant pattern of easy-to-block projectiles, and Dracula's ghost teleports around the room dealing tons of damage like he did in the first game. Well, he's supposed to. In actuality, you can stun-lock him in place with 0 effort. In fact, all these bosses can be stun-locked by basically every sub-weapon in the game, even by garlic, trivializing them even further. As if that wasn't anticlimactic enough, the bosses will respawn when you leave the screen and come back just like any other enemy. I can't even begin to fathom why the game was shipped like this, especially since the bosses from Castlevania were so well thought out and synergized with the sub-weapon and power-up placement. It's just sad, honestly. The subpar level design, terrible boss fights, and basic enemies mean that the game is relying solely on its exploration and riddles to carry the experience. We've already gone over how the translation negatively impacts this part of the game, but it gets worse. How the hell are players supposed to figure out the riddles that involve kneeling with the blue and red orbs without hearing the solutions from an external source like Nintendo Power, where this game was prominently featured? How are players supposed to know where to drop garlic in the cemeteries to summon NPCs? A few of the game's tools are locked behind these sketchy graveyard deals. How are they supposed to know that the ferryman will take you to a different location while you're holding Dracula's heart? Your only hint is a villager informing you that the ferryman likes garlic, pretty much the total opposite of a vampire's heart in my mind. Also, garlic is already an item, and it doesn't cause the ferryman's destination to change. Most of this stuff is required to complete the game, and yet there's almost no way that a player could realistically discover all of these on their own. Simon's Quest is renowned for its obtuse design, and it lives up to that reputation in every conceivable way. Once you reach the final stretch of the game, you'll walk through the empty halls of Castlevania to revive Dracula. The entryway is in ruins, the elegant windows have been shattered, and the pillars that supported the grand hallways of this once imposing structure have given way to moss and ivy as nature reclaims what remains of it. The town outside this vacant castle is equally devoid of life, evoking a sense of haunting isolation and dread. It is eerie, and the song that plays here, within these castle walls, is trying its hardest to sell the scene. It almost succeeds. This is ambitious by the standards of NES games, but like many parts of Simon's Quest, falls completely flat. Perhaps if the game had been great up to this point, it would have created a sense of tension through contrast, but as it stands, it just doesn't work because the mansions leading up to this moment barely had anything to threaten you anyways. Pushing through all the nothing burger boss fights and esoteric riddles rewards you with the most boring part of the entire game and what must have been one of the easiest final boss fights ever. While Simon's Quest ended up being a massive step down in overall quality, there is a solid foundation here, and the goal of making a more adventurous and grandiose title would persist as Akamatsu and his team began working on their next project, the sequel prequel, Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse. This conclusion to the NES trilogy dropped the RPG elements in the timer so it could return to the level design principles that made the original Castlevania such a classic, but this wasn't a retreat to the relative safety of the first game's proven formula. Dracula's Curse has the largest scope of any Castlevania game yet, and it flaunts its scale with a regional map that acts as its level transition screen. This gets replaced by a map of the castle once you reach the late game. As players progress, they'll encounter forks in the road that take them through different locales on their journey to the castle. This helps Castlevania III feel more like a proper adventure by preserving some of the exploration from Simon's Quest, while still allowing the level designers to craft a series of tightly directed blocks reminiscent of those from the first game. Gone are the boring, flat environments in between Transylvania's mansions. In their place are mad forests, haunted graveyards, ghost ships, monster-infested marshes, and disgusting flesh caverns. Okay, the flesh caverns were in Simon's Quest. Dracula's Curse is so large you won't be able to see every block without replaying the game. Each potential route has unique levels, bosses, and enemies in addition to chance encounters with potential companions that can accompany you on your journey. The main character of this title is a newcomer named Trevor Belmont, an exiled monster hunter and the first of the Belmont clan to face off against Dracula after his rise to power. Trevor has the same refined control scheme as his descendant, down to using the same family heirloom as his weapon of choice, and has access to all the sub-weapons that Simon used in his first quest to take down Dracula. They all function in exactly the same way that they did in the original Castlevania II. For all gameplay purposes, he is exactly the same as Simon Belmont. I guess the swagger of his strut runs in the family. You can switch between vampire killers on the fly, but the twist is that Trevor can only travel with one of 3 possible partners at a time. Both characters in your party share a health and ammo pool, meaning that traveling with a buddy won't make taking damage any less punishing or collecting hearts any less complicated than it was in the first Castlevania. This simplicity works in the game's favor, even if it doesn't make all that much logical sense. A pirate named Grant is the earliest companion you can encounter. He can jump higher than everyone else and climb on walls, and has access to all the standard sub-weapons we've come to know and love. All you have to do to cling to walls and ceilings is hold the D-pad down in the direction of a solid surface. You can climb around corners with the diagonal input, and you'll have to adjust your thumb according to your position to stay attached. This unique movement mechanic is incredibly fun to use, and allows you to bypass some hazards completely. He even has a special interaction with the throwing knife and the axe that allow him to toss one out even while he's attached to walls. Grant's crouch is a little lower than the other characters as well, which helps him avoid a few more projectiles than they can. This ends up being pretty important since he isn't as durable as Trevor and has to get closer to enemies to hit them with his small dagger. This low effective range makes him the weakest playable character in the game, at least when it comes to combat, for obvious reasons. To compensate for this, Grant's jump has air control, unlike everybody else's, making him the go-to character for tackling the game's platforming challenges. It's odd to me that this is restricted to a specific character because of how much it improves the game feel. It makes me wonder what the purpose of the stiff jump arcs is. Perhaps the game designers didn't want players to worry about aiming their attacks during a jump, and achieve this by locking your character into their jump's trajectory. This prevents players from accidentally changing direction in midair while they're trying to attack something, ultimately making the jump attacks more reliable. The second character, Sypha the Witch, who's just as frail as Grant, has a staff that deals a pitiful amount of melee damage. She doesn't have access to any of Trevor's sub-weapons except for the pocket watch, but she can acquire 3 unique sub-weapons in the form of spells. There's a flamethrower attack, a frozen crystal blast with the ability to freeze enemies, projectiles, and water in place, and a volley of lightning orbs capable of homing in on targets. These spellbooks replace the standard sub-weapon drops that Trevor would normally receive from candles. The flame attack is not quite as useful as the others, but it's fairly reliable and common since it's her equivalent of the dagger and the axe. The ice spell fittingly replaces the holy water drops, a remarkably intuitive and easy to remember connection, and her powerful lightning spell takes the place of the boomerang. Sypha's reliance on these spells is her defining character trait, so she's constantly hungry for hearts. The final character is Alucard, the son of Dracula himself. His basic attack is a potent fire blast that can be upgraded to work like the one his father used in the first game, minus the teleportation. Unlike Sypha, Alucard doesn't get access to any unique sub-weapons and only has access to the pocket watch. He has pretty limited utility and struggles to deal with some enemies because of this, but he can spend 1 heart per second to transform into a bat and fly around. Players can exploit this to circumvent challenging platforming sections and gauntlets of enemies. This might sound a little cheap on paper, but it takes more effort than you think to evade all the obstacles and monsters that later blocks throw at you. He's basically defenseless while transformed, so you often have to combine both the pocket watch and the power of flight to get through difficult sections unscathed, and that chews through a ton of hearts. The route to recruiting Alucard is also the most challenging one in the game, so there's a few trade-offs associated with him. Having access to 2 characters adds more strategy to the sub-weapon system by allowing you to carry 2 of them at a time and switch between them on the fly. This accomplishes the same goal of the inventory system from Simon's Quest, but in a more streamlined way that doesn't require players to fiddle with a menu screen during gameplay. This extra layer of decision-making is compounded by the unique abilities that each companion has access to. Grant has access to tons of weapons just like Trevor, while Alucard only has access to 1, which ultimately puts more pressure on players to hold on to the right tool for Trevor should they choose to travel with Alucard. The Morningstar upgrade that empowers your whip plays into this too. While it might seem like it's only useful to Trevor at first, since the first 2 characters you'll encounter don't have weapon upgrades, Alucard can pick them up to empower his fireballs. This is interesting because it forces players to choose which characters' attacks they want to commit to using throughout the stage, or at least which ones they want to upgrade first. These mechanics also make death more punishing since it wipes away all the sub-weapons and power-ups you've acquired. While Castlevania I did this as well, the potential punishment here is twice as severe because you can carry twice as many items. Dracula's Quest continues the original game's legacy of excellent level design, and tons of care was put into introducing its new hazards to the player in as fair a manner as possible. Everything I praised about the original game applies here, but they've also added more stage-exclusive gimmicks and quite a few new recurring obstacles too. The level designers always introduce these one at a time, and typically avoid teaching players about more than 1 recurring hazard per block, instead opting to slowly mix and match them as the game progresses. For example, the first stage shows off a few of these reversible platforms that spin around if you land on them after jumping or getting knocked back by an enemy, and you're given a risk-free opportunity to try them out. Later on, you'll be forced to cross entire bridges made of this unstable footing while being assaulted by the returning Medusa heads from both sides. The optional second stage, a clock tower, sees Trevor platforming across spinning gears that make it harder to time your jumps. These return in later blocks. The forest stage is full of unique flora and fauna like these birds of prey and the multiplying spores that blow around in the wind. The game's lower path takes you through a swamp full of mud that you'll slowly sink in as monsters rise up from the muck. Some portions of this area have moving platforms that you can use to avoid getting your boots dirty, but if you make a mistake you'll have to contend with the swamp creatures while your movement is inhibited. The swamp takes us underground into a fleshy cavern. This is probably my least favorite block in the game because both of its unique mechanics revolve around making you wait for things. Initially, liquid drops down from the ceiling and erodes the stone tiles of the stage, and if you wait long enough it'll open up some optional paths. By the end of the stage, though, you're being forced to wait for the roof of the cave to drip, drip, drip. The falling tiles introduced in the next block are probably the most annoying part of any of the games I've covered in this video. Not only do these Tetris blocks deal damage to you when they land on your head, but you have to wait for them to stack themselves up to progress on multiple occasions. This mechanic is taught to players just as well as everything else, but it gets old fast. They fall in a set pattern, so the main challenge here is repeating the same small movements for some set amount of time before you can progress. This culminates in a nightmarishly long block stacking segment leading up to Dracula's castle that takes a few minutes of patience to complete, and if you die, you have to start all over. This area is in the middle of a really long stage with a full-on mini-boss and a boss rush at the end, and getting a game over will guarantee that you have to do this entire rigmarole again. It is the worst, but at least it's part of the game's hardest route, so you can consider it optional. Let's take the surface path instead. The ghost ship focuses more on platforming than the other levels, and features a lot of gaps in the floor and unstable footing. On the first screen of the area, you're given a chance to experiment with a seesaw without being expected to make any jumps off of it. This lonesome physics object is here just to inform you that the mechanic exists and will show up again, and it does later in this very block, and the subsequent blocks unique to this route. These are much more pleasant to deal with than the falling tiles, although there won't be an opportunity to recruit Alucard by going this way. The block we reach after disembarking from the ghost ship is focused on vertical challenges like scaling stairs and crossing bridges, a theme that'll carry through to every stage of Dracula's castle just like it did in the first game. This is where we encounter one of the biggest flaws with Castlevania III. It's hard to use sub-weapons while you're on or near a staircase. This was the case in previous games as well, but this is the first game where it becomes a major inconvenience because of how many sections of Dracula's curse revolve around dealing with erratic enemies and skeleton turrets while climbing the most precarious stairways known to man. Stage 9 in particular has an absolutely brutal section where you have to scale a waterfall while being assaulted by flying soldiers and fireballs from both sides. It is possible to weave through this area without getting hit, but you'll need to be precise and a little bit lucky to do it, let alone do it consistently. The stairs are the most viable footing on this screen for the entire section because each platform is small enough that the knockback from taking damage will send you tumbling down. Whenever you're near stairs, pressing up on the D-pad mounts them. This competes with the up and B input required to use a sub-weapon. While climbing stairs, you move a bit slower and your character's movement animation seems to take priority over the animations related to all of your attacks. As a result, you need to time your inputs very carefully to actually use a sub-weapon. Under normal circumstances, you can start holding up on the D-pad before pressing B to use a sub-weapon, and there's no real timing required outside of aligning yourself with a target. While it seems like that should be the case on stairs too, it doesn't feel very consistent with every sub-weapon even if you're spamming the attack button while holding up. Something definitely feels off here, and that lack of reliability can easily result in your death. In addition, your feet are firmly planted on the steps until you reach one end of the flight of stairs you're scaling. There's no way to jump up or drop down. This isn't all bad since stairs negate knockback from enemies too, but this means that your movement options, and therefore your methods of dodging incoming damage, are extremely limited anytime stairs come into play. It would be nice if players were allowed to jump on and off stairs at their leisure, even if doing so at the wrong time would end up throwing them into the abyss beneath the borders of the screen. By the second half of the game, especially once you reach the castle, the complexity of the platforming challenges and enemy arrangements is significantly higher than anything found in Castlevania III's predecessors. There are numerous unique set pieces that act as memorable crescendo events. These more than compensate for the lack of cinematic pacing in Simon's Quest. Some of the longer blocks have mini-bosses that accentuate their midpoint and add variety, a great addition that would become a staple of future classic Castlevania games. Some of these boss-tier threats are used more than once, as is the case with the Multiplying Bat and the Cyclops, which first appear as full-on stage bosses before being demoted to mini-boss and boss rush fodder, respectively. To illustrate the density of each block, let's zoom in on the variety of vignettes in the first one. After an admittedly lame intro cutscene, you take control of Trevor in some decrepit old ruins before exploring a chapel that connects to a town that's under siege by Dracula's minions, before ending with a fight in a graveyard. These longer blocks end up being much more formidable than the concise ones from Castlevania I, and the pork chops that still act as your sole source of healing are just as scarce as ever, meaning that Dracula's Curse is the most challenging game yet. Some of these sequences are downright masochistic, and getting sent back to the start of one of them by a game over can feel like a devastating loss of progress. Because of this, I don't think it's feasible for a new player to beat this game in a single play session like the first one, despite the still unlimited continues. The developers clearly agreed with this sentiment, because they introduced a quick and easy icon-based password system for this adventure, a significant improvement on the unremarkable and lengthy secure password generator type strings from Simon's Quest. Most modern players probably won't use something like this because save states are more convenient, but this is a clean and simple password system that doesn't ask you to write down a bunch of unintuitive letters and numbers to save your progress, and we appreciate that kind of attention to detail in my household. The boss fights are mechanically on par with the ones from the first game at the worst of times, and significantly better at the best of times. They're also more varied than the previous titles, and a few of them even have a twist. For instance, your encounter with the Dragonbone King is interrupted as it tries to flee from you by smashing through the ceiling of its boss chamber, flooding the room with water. The music suddenly changes to a track suitably titled Pressure, and you're tasked with escaping the area while being assaulted by fishmen as the water level slowly rises. The critically injured Bone Dragon re-enters the scene by smashing through a wall at the end of the sequence, tying everything together in a pretty dramatic fashion. The mummy men from the first game make a return here, but only as part of a larger series of boss rushes that force you to confront the aforementioned Cyclops and a winged demon as well. Even the more mundane encounters like the multiplying bat promote a careful use of your sub-weapons just like the best boss fights from the first game did, but they can still spiral out of control if you execute your strategy poorly. The very first boss is a skeletal soldier that's fairly easy to take down even without a sub-weapon, making it a less effective tutorial than the Phantom Bat from the opening of Castlevania I. I would have preferred to see something that teaches us about the holy water or the boomerang here, since the first boss in the original game already taught us about the axe, but this guy seems more like he was designed to teach you the importance of moving around the arena during a fight. The graveyard you encounter this boss in has a few platforms that you can use to loop around the screen and kite him while avoiding damage. This lesson is not quite as valuable to new players as teaching them about sub-weapons would have been, considering that sub-weapons are more important than ever in Dracula's Curse, thanks to the ability to carry two of them at once. Unfortunately, his pretty boring visual design sets a trend that persists throughout the rest of the game. Castlevania III's bosses failed to reach the same memorable heights as the ones from the OG, probably because the team used up most of their iconic inspirations there and had to reach a little bit further towards the bottom of the barrel this time around. There are a lot of levels that end with a boss rush, and these skirmishes recycle the same premise every time. A ghost possesses the remains of monsters contained in a series of coffins, and you have to destroy all of its potential vessels to defeat it. Things start to improve when you reach the climactic castle stages, although one of the bosses is Death, and we've seen him show up in every single game so far. I guess Death and Dracula are more than business partners, they're besties that go way back. His fight is reminiscent of the one from the first game, although you can't cheese him with the holy water anymore. Every sub-weapon is available in the hallway preceding his chamber, although collecting them can be a bit of a challenge since the floor starts to collapse behind you after a few steps. The two weapons you'll want most for Trevor are the boomerang or the axe. The boomerang serves the same role here as it did in the first game, destroying his scythes, which once again spawn around the screen randomly and float towards you, menacingly. You have a lot more room to maneuver in this fight than in the OG because of how the platforms are arranged, and that alone helps the encounter feel more balanced. They've also made Death's sprite a bit larger, and he has a tendency to bounce on the floor, giving you tons of easy opportunities to strike him with the whip. Sypha's Lightning Orb, which is easy to acquire right before the fight from the same candle that drops the boomerang for Trevor, absolutely obliterates him and his scythes. Death has two phases here, but the second one is significantly easier than the first, even though it makes him resistant to some attacks. He transforms into a giant skull and follows a predictable path of spirals across the screen while occasionally spitting out a singular scythe. This scythe doesn't behave any differently from the ones in the first phase, which shows that they're only hard to dodge because of how numerous they are. When he reaches the edge of one side of the screen, he emerges from the edge of the other. I guess Dracula's castle is a non-Euclidean space after all, or maybe we can blame Death's magic for the questionable gameplay loop of Vampire Killer. The boss of Stage 9, the Doppelganger, is an interesting one. It'll take the form of whatever character you're playing and change its shape if you change your character. It has access to sub-weapons and it isn't afraid to use them, although it seems like it only has one per character. The boomerang for Trevor, the fire spell for Sypha, and the axe for Grant. Navigating the arena for this fight's the most challenging thing about it since the boss shares your moveset, removing the need to learn what it's capable of. You're basically forced to confront the doppelganger directly if you want to take it down by utilizing a powerful sub-weapon, like the aforementioned lightning orbs, or trick it into following you so you can trap it in a corner. If you trap yourself in a corner, the fight's basically over since, unlike you, this thing deals contact damage. You can easily face tank this faker's attacks if you come into the fight with full health, since it can't strike nearly as fast as a player who mashes the attack button, but I've never been able to do that since the room before this encounter is ridiculously hard to deal with on account of these 4 birds. You'd think that a doppelganger would be scarier than a bird, but not in Castlevania. These things move erratically and can approach you at angles that make it hard to hit them before they hit you. The room is large enough that at least 2 of these birds will respawn as you travel from one end of it to the other and back, meaning that there's actually 6 of these winged cretins to deal with per boss attempt. To make things worse, this flooded room is sorely lacking in solid ground for players to stand on. The water flowing through the chamber will constantly push our protagonists around, and an endlessly respawning horde of mermen will harass you while you try to shoo the stupid birds away. On the bright side, the birds die when they deal damage to you, but that doesn't make the room any less frustrating. Dracula himself has 3 phases, and each of them is really quite simple. In Phase 1, he'll teleport around the room as per usual before summoning 2 pillars of flame from the ground to trap you. There's a generously long animation that telegraphs where he's teleporting to this time. After a short delay, a third, larger pillar will erupt wherever the player is standing. This can result in seemingly unavoidable damage, but the player does have some control over where the smaller pillars appear. The further away you are from Dracula when he arrives at his destination, the more space there will be between the 2 small flames. From there, it's just a matter of not standing still for too long while you try to strike at the Count's head. The second phase is grotesque looking, but not particularly challenging. Each of Dracula's goopy faces has its own health bar, and each one needs to be killed in order to progress the fight. This phase doesn't really have any formal attacks, it just floats around the room while dripping ooze that deals damage. The more faces you destroy, the less gunk there is to worry about. Passing underneath this monstrosity can be a bit dangerous at first, but after you've skinned off a few of the faces, it's nothing to worry about. The final phase looks intimidating, but all Dracula can do in this stationary, statue-like form is launch projectiles from his hands and eyes. The most challenging part of this phase is to hit his face, since it's so high up off the ground. The easiest way to do this is to launch a volley of throwing axes in his general direction, but if this isn't an option, you can use the moving platforms that come out of the ground to reach his head. This approach ends up being pretty dangerous though, since those moving platforms leave holes in the floor as they rise into the air, and you can get thrown into those upon taking damage. It's a good final fight, and it has that same sense of spectacle that the first game had, musical switch-ups and all. The songs that score the final boss fight are suitably epic this time, transitioning between themes once you get to Dracula's grotesque second phase and persisting until you slay his third form. As the heroes watch the castle crumble, we get a little bit of insight into what will become of them after conquering Castlevania. The imagery of the ending and the associated text will change depending on the characters in your party. Each of the 3 possible duos has a unique animation associated with their ending, and there's a mysterious one made specifically for the people who decide to solo the game with Trevor. Grant decides to rebuild his life in the city that Dracula's destruction took from him. Sypha and Trevor hook up on the backdrop of the rising sun and go on to start a family together, and Alucard ponders the implications of his patricide, presumably going into hiding after he and Trevor part ways. The translation isn't perfect, but the text is legible by NES standards, and the striking vistas brought to life through the use of rich colors. The deep blue sea contrasts the orange sky, while the greenery of the surrounding mountains complements the shimmering water and the rocky cliffside that the castle was built upon. The gorgeous visuals play a big role in defining the scope of the adventure just like they did in the original. This dark fantasy world is defined by its tasteful color palettes, sumptuous visual effects, and intricately animated backgrounds. One specific technique I'd like to draw attention to is the careful use of 8-bit stippling to create believable shading and to seamlessly blend or transition between colors. The NES's technology didn't give developers a huge palette to work with, so they had to make the most of it. There's a funny visual quirk that shows us just how hard they had to work to achieve these visuals. All the moving platforms share their color palette with the playable character's sprites, so changing your character while they're on screen will change their color too. The art direction is genuinely impressive, and you can tell that Akamatsu and his team had learned a lot from working on the previous 2 titles, both in terms of what Castlevania should look like and how to best utilize the hardware. The music surpasses the quality standards set by the previous titles, with just as many jubilant Baroque pop loops as always, but the composers dip their toes into slow-paced songs more focused on setting the mood than getting you to tap your feet, sort of like Within These Castle Walls from Castlevania II. The musical identity of the series is still running strong, and these songs are chock full of catchy melodic hooks and punchy drum beats. I'm kind of running out of ways to talk about the scores here, but that isn't because the music is weak, not even close. The music that backs the clock tower level is pretty lame though. It's a short and grating loop that's by far the weakest song in the game. It works well for the short section at the end of the Bone Dragon fight, but not so well for an entire stage. Conversely, when you finally reach Dracula's castle, you're greeted by a remixed version of Vampire Killer from the first game, bringing the trilogy full circle as you approach its hardest climax yet. It's a very memorable moment that future games would try to capture by reusing the entryway from Castlevania I, but none of them managed to pull it off as well as Dracula's Curse does. Castlevania III fell victim to some bizarre localization just like Castlevania II did, albeit in a much different manner. There are a ton of regional differences between the Japanese Famicom and US NES versions of the game that go well beyond the realm of translation and deep into the nitty-gritty bits of the game's mechanics. The most obvious of these are the changes they made to Grant for the US release. We've already gone over what he can do in the US version, but he was originally much more powerful. Instead of a puny stab, the throwing knife subweapon is supposed to be his primary attack. He doesn't have access to all of Trevor's subweapons in this version though, his arsenal's restricted just like the other companions. He can make use of the pocket watch and the throwing axe, meaning you can carry around 2 reliable ranged attacks while controlling him. His mobility options feel about the same to me, so all this puts his power level a lot closer to Sypha's and Alucard's. This makes a lot of sense and helps Trevor feel more distinct. As a seasoned warrior, he's accustomed to fighting with a wider range of weapons than everybody else. The way damage is handled is significantly different too. In the Japanese version, enemy projectiles deal a unique amount of damage regardless of which block of the game you're playing, which is used to make some enemies less threatening and to achieve a smoother difficulty curve throughout the game. A small but mobile enemy will deal less damage than a big, scary knight or a bone dragon is going to. This is intuitive and keeps some of the sections where there are tons of enemies to fight, of which there are many, from feeling unfair. Those damn birds still deal way too much damage though. The US version takes the same approach as the original Castlevania. All the threats in a stage deal the same amount of damage based on how far along you are in the game. They'll deal 2 hit points of damage during the first third of the game, 3 during the middle third, and 4 during the final third. The early blocks of the US version are a little bit easier because of this change, but the trade-off is that the later blocks are significantly more challenging. I would argue that this makes the game a little bit worse all around. While this system worked well in the first title, the levels are longer, more intricate, and demand more precision from the player in Castlevania III, and the finely tuned damage numbers of the Japanese version are what enabled the developers to design them this way. The layouts of the early stages don't make as much of an impression as they should have because of how easy it is to brute force their obstacles, and the later stages have an unusually tight margin of error, even by the standards of this already brutal franchise. Even worse, this makes the extra damage that Sypha and Grant take from all sources all but irrelevant in the late game. They'll lose 5 points of health instead of 4 per instance of damage, but you have 16 health points that can't be upgraded, so they can still take up to 4 hits regardless. Oops. Much of the subweapon placement was altered for the US release, although I don't find any of these changes to be all that significant, except for one. This candle right in front of Dracula's chamber drops a boomerang in the Japanese version, which translates to the lightning orb for Sypha, but in the US release it drops a dagger instead. This ensures that the player is not properly equipped for the climax. Dracula's fight's a bit harder overall due to a combination of factors. Those weaker subweapons play a role, but the damage value of his first phase's attacks were doubled due to the changes to the way damage is dished out in America, and his last phase's laser attack was made much longer. Additionally, Dracula can now fire his evil bolts at basically any angle instead of only being able to shoot downwards like his hands would suggest. In Japan, the floating platforms are pretty safe, and you're incentivized to ride them in order to avoid Dracula's projectiles, but it's almost too risky to bother with them in the localized version where you can just throw axes from a safe distance instead. The changes don't stop there though. In what must have been an act of pure malice, the respawn point for the final boss was moved a few rooms backwards for the US release. I went out of my way to thank the developers for placing a hard respawn point at the base of Dracula's staircase in the OG, But they've gone and done us burger folk dirty this time. Real dirty. Every time you die to Dracula, you have to redo this platforming section where you jump between a few swinging pendulums while being assaulted by a continuous and pseudo-random stream of bats. These bats don't always appear in the same places, meaning that you can lose lives to unavoidable bullshit enemy placement. These bats aren't even present in the Japanese version, so they must have added these knowing that my fellow Americans and I would have to go through this room multiple times. There are some notable surface-level changes to the US version as well, but the developers at Konami are not necessarily responsible for them. For one, all those well-clothed marble statues were pretty much nude in the original game. Just imagine all the rage we'd see about that today. More importantly, the Famicom cartridge had a custom coprocessor chip inside of it, Konami's own VRC6, which was one of many custom parts that Konami made use of to improve the presentation of their games. Nintendo wisely put expansion pins inside of the cartridge slot of the Famicom, and that made it easy for games to take advantage of them. In this case, it gave Castlevania III's composers an opportunity to add 3 additional audio channels and, from the sounds of it, some additional audio effects and instruments. These had to be stripped out of the game for the American release because the NES hardware didn't give game cartridges the same level of freedom that the Famicom did. Nintendo decided to move the expansion pins to their own dedicated port on the bottom of the console. Maybe it was worth it since our controllers weren't hardwired into the console though. I don't know what they were thinking there. This sad reality limited the Castlevania team to the typical 5 sound layers of the NES instead of 8. It's genuinely tragic for hayseeds like me because Konami's team really did put those expanded sound capabilities to work to enhance the mood of the world. All these regional changes add up to make the Japanese version a slightly smoother and more fleshed out experience, although I think both iterations of the game are about the same in terms of overall quality despite that. You can't go wrong either way. The reasoning behind the unnecessary mechanical changes are anyone's guess. The most popular theory is that it was an attempt by Konami to combat the Western game rental market by making the game too hard to be beaten in a single rental period. Personally, I see the US version as a sort of hard mode, not to be confused with the game's actual hard mode, which is similar to the one from the first Castlevania. Funnily enough, the hard modes also vary between each version of the game, and once again, the US version was designed to be more challenging. Does that make the US hard mode like the super hard mode? Introducing Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse, Prepare to Die Edition, Simon Dies Twice. Coming into hard mode with Grant or Alucard allows you access to a few candles in the early game that Trevor can't reach by himself. You won't get a chance to recruit a new companion during hard mode, so this will be your party for the entire run. Enemies deal more damage, move slightly faster, and there's a lot more of them. These Medusa-like skulls in particular show up a lot in hard mode, and their erratic movements make them tough to deal with, especially while you're on stairs or platforming. They're everywhere in the US hard mode too, so thanks for that, guys. Unlike the first Castlevania, the second quest's modifiers stay relevant for the entire game because they've rearranged the enemy placement and added more brutal obstacles to deal with in literally every block. It's an excellent New Game Plus feature that helps players squeeze even more enjoyment out of a game that's already highly replayable. This is some genuinely good value for your money, even by today's standards. No matter what version you play, Castlevania III Dracula's Curse is a fantastic finale to the NES trilogy. It expands on everything that was great about its predecessors while bringing quite a few innovations of its own to the table. However, it would not have been able to exist without remixing and refining some of the gameplay concepts proposed in Simon's Quest and Vampire Killer. While it is crushing to see a sophomore slump of Castlevania II's magnitude, there's a certain beauty in looking at it in retrospect because of how immediately beneficial its very existence was to the franchise. Not only that, it brought people together by practically forcing them to collaborate to solve its riddles and uncover its secrets. It introduced many to the innovative and entertaining pages of Nintendo Power and opened the door for many of the open-ended side-scrolling adventure games that would be released in the future. Even though I don't like it, I can't begrudge anybody for loving that about it, nor could I condemn them for enjoying the experience of trading tips and rumors with other gamers at school. However, I think there were other NES games that accomplished the same goals while providing a better overall experience. The real value of Simon's Quest is in its historical significance. We can see both the artistic benefits and downsides of big risks in this project. While it might not be a good game on its own merits, some successful experiments are not defined by their actual quality, but by their influence. Your game doesn't need to knock everything out of the park to influence other creatives, it just needs to try something new. While it's hard to justify returning to it when both of the other Castlevania games on the NES are so good, you can thank this unfinished mess for that Hollow Knight game you all love so much. Indeed, Simon's Quest has a unique claim to fame. It inspired Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, and the Metroidvania genre as a whole with the help of Metroid. Castlevania fans would have to wait quite a few years before the series would return to something resembling this style of gameplay, and when it did, they definitely learned from the mistakes of Simon's Quest. Koji Igarashi, the director of Symphony and its sequels, said during an interview with US Gamer that the focus on exploration in Castlevania II was the reason that he and his team were able to justify their own focus on exploration to Konami's stubborn executives. It was also a direction that, at the time, hadn't been explored much compared to the standard platforming that defined the other classic Castlevanias, making it easier to pitch the shift in priorities to fans opposed to the change. They took a lot of the ideas proposed in Simon's Quest and expanded on them. Not only are there tons of sub-weapons and spells that you can collect throughout Igarashi's Castlevania games, but alternative forms, passive upgrades, non-sub-weapons, dom-weapons, armors, familiars, and all kinds of other trinkets. They deliberately avoided making NPCs that tell players lies, though. That's probably good. While Castlevania III ended with a bang, the real-life team behind it wasn't so lucky. The creative spark that laid the groundwork for these innovations would be snuffed out shortly after the sales data for Dracula's Curse started rolling in. Each Castlevania title had sold fewer copies than the last, ultimately causing Konami to demote Akamatsu and reassign him to his old stomping grounds in their arcade development branch. There, he would wallow in obscurity before eventually leaving Konami and the gaming industry altogether. Fortunately for us, the series had firmly established itself in the public's consciousness and was therefore a reliable enough property that Konami would continue producing games under the franchise's moniker even without the original creators' involvement. Many of those releases would go on to garner critical acclaim and their own audience of devoted fans, turning Castlevania into a household name across the globe. Despite the characteristically tragic ending of the story, the influence of the NES Castlevania trilogy cannot be understated. Akamatsu and his team left one hell of a legacy behind, with even their failures acting as a catalyst for greater things.